For 5 years, Callan Mercer sat at the top of the sales board at Veyron Holdings. He never campaigned for it. He never asked for recognition. He simply closed the contracts nobody else could close, quarter after quarter, until his name became the answer to a question no one needed to ask anymore. Then came the promotion meeting. Chairman Alistair Vane stood at the head of the table and said the seat of vice president belonged to his daughter, Serafina. The room went silent. Callan nodded once, set his employee badge on the table, and said 4 words. Then he stood up and walked out, and nobody tried to stop him. 1 year later, as Veyron stood at the edge of collapse, the boardroom door opened without warning, and the man who walked through it was Callan Mercer. The performance board in the main conference room at Veyron Holdings had not changed its top line in 5 straight years. Every quarter, in the same block letters, the same name appeared under the header that read, Top Sales Performance, Callan Mercer. Nobody in the building needed to check twice. New hires learned his name before they learned where the coffee machine was, and senior partners learned to stop pretending they had a better closer on staff. He was the man they called when a deal looked dead, when a client had already walked out of 2 meetings, when the legal team said the terms could never work. He made them work. He did it quietly, without theater, without needing anyone in the room to watch him do it. He was not the kind of man who wanted a stage. He arrived early, before the lights in the East Wing were even fully on, and he left late, long after the analysts had gone home to their apartments and their takeout containers. In between, he carried himself with a stillness that unsettled people who were used to salesmen who talked with their hands and raised their voices to fill a room. Callan did the opposite. He lowered his voice when a negotiation got tense, and the room leaned in to hear him, and that was usually the moment he won. There was a particular kind of deal that everyone else at Veyron avoided, the account that had already gone sour twice. The client, who had already fired 1 vendor and was halfway through firing a second, the contract buried under so many red flags that legal had stopped bothering to mark them up. Those were the files that ended up on Callan's desk, quietly, without fanfare, because someone above him had learned that handing him an impossible problem was often the fastest way to make it disappear. He never asked why the file had landed with him instead of someone else. He simply opened it, read every page twice, and started making calls. Colleagues who worked near him began to notice a pattern in the way he prepared. Before a difficult client call, he would sit for several minutes with nothing in front of him but a blank legal pad, writing nothing, saying nothing, simply thinking through every version of the conversation that could unfold. By the time he picked up the phone, he had already lived through 6 different arguments and had an answer ready for each one. It was not charisma that made him effective. It was preparation so thorough that charisma became unnecessary. At 42, Callan lived a life built entirely around discipline. He was a single father. And though the story of his life outside those glass walls belonged to him alone, colleagues sometimes noticed the quiet signs of it: the way he left promptly at 6 on certain evenings without explanation, the way he never took client dinners that ran past a certain hour, the way he refused, every single time, to let anyone cover his responsibilities so he could take a vacation he clearly needed. He built his life so that he depended on no one, and expected the people around him to hold up their end, without him having to ask twice. In 5 years, Callan had done more for Veyron than any 5 executives combined. He won accounts that competitors had chased for a decade. He opened 3 new regional markets when the board had assumed expansion was off the table for another 2 years. He rescued contracts that were 1 signature away from falling apart, sometimes flying out on a Friday night with nothing but a folder and a plan nobody else had thought to draft. He built relationships with clients so notoriously difficult that other account managers avoided their calls, and those same clients would only speak with him. And yet, in 5 years, Callan Mercer had never once been offered a seat at the leadership table. He was consulted. He was praised in quarterly reviews. He was handed bonuses that made accountants raise their eyebrows. But when the doors of the executive floor closed for strategy meetings, Callan stayed on the sales floor, closing the next deal, as if his only value to the company began and ended with a signature on a page. One evening, a colleague leaned against the frame of his office door and said what half the building had been saying under their breath for months. 5 years at the top. Surely this time they would have to give him the seat. Callan did not look up from the contract in front of him. He simply said that he did not need anyone to hand him something he had already proven he deserved. The colleague laughed, assuming it was modesty. It was not modesty. It was a man who had stopped waiting for permission a long time ago. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning, requesting his presence at a special meeting with Chairman Alistair Veyron. No agenda was attached. No explanation was given. Callan read it twice, closed his laptop, and allowed himself, for the first time in 5 years, to believe that his moment had finally come. He walked into the boardroom at 9 o'clock sharp, and the first thing he noticed was that Serafina Veyron was already seated in the chair reserved for leadership, the one at the chairman's right hand, the one that had never, in Callan's memory, belonged to anyone under the rank of senior vice president. She looked up at him and smiled the kind of smile that belongs to someone who already knows the ending of a story the other person has not yet been told. She asked if he still did not know why they were all gathered here today. Callan did not answer. He simply took his seat and waited. A handful of colleagues had gathered near the doorway before the meeting began, exchanging quiet bets on what the announcement would be. Most agreed it could only mean one thing: 5 years running the same board, 5 years of numbers nobody else in the company could match, and now a sudden meeting called by the chairman himself, with Callan's name specifically requested. It did not take a great deal of imagination to draw the obvious conclusion, and for a few minutes, even the most cynical among them allowed themselves to believe Veyron was finally about to do something that made sense. Alistair Veyron opened the meeting with warm words about 5 years of extraordinary performance, and for a moment, the room believed exactly what Callan believed, that this was the day the company would finally do the right thing. Alistair spoke about legacy. He spoke about what it meant to build something that would outlast a single career, a single lifetime, a single name on a board. He spoke, with something close to pride, about the need for a new generation of leadership at Veyron Holdings. Then he said the words that changed everything. Serafina would become vice president of sales. The room went still, in a way that felt almost physical, the kind of silence that presses against the ears. Nolan Pierce, seated near the far end of the table, glanced sideways at Callan, waiting for some reaction that never came. Callan did not flinch. He did not lean back in his chair, or clench his jaw, or do any of the things a lesser man might have done in front of an audience. He simply looked at Alistair and asked, in a voice as level as a closing statement, where exactly his 5 years of results were meant to be counted. Alistair told him that sales talent and leadership talent were not the same thing. Callan asked whether blood was the same thing as leadership talent either. The temperature of the room dropped by several degrees. Alistair warned him, quietly, not to cross a line he could not walk back from. Serafina, doing her best impression of professionalism, told Callan that he could keep doing what he did best. Selling. The words were polite. The intent behind them was not. Serafina had spent the last 2 years in the company's strategy division, a department known more for its polished presentations than for any measurable revenue it had ever produced. She had never carried a client relationship on her own, never sat across from a buyer who had already said no twice, never negotiated a deal down from the edge of collapse at 11 at night, with nothing but her own judgment to rely on. What she had instead was a surname that opened doors nobody else in that division needed opened, and a father who had decided, quietly and without consulting a single person outside his own household, that experience could be assigned rather than earned. Callan looked at her for a long moment, long enough that the silence itself became an answer. He did not argue. He did not beg for a chance to prove himself further, as though 5 years had not already been proof enough. He reached into his jacket, took out a pen, and began writing on a blank sheet of paper in front of him. Alistair asked what he was signing. Callan set the pen down, aligned it perfectly with the edge of the page, and told him it was his resignation. The room did not move. Alistair, for the first time in years, looked like a man who had lost the thread of his own meeting. He said Callan was simply angry, that he should take the weekend, that decisions made in the heat of a moment were rarely decisions a man should keep. Nolan urged him, quietly, to reconsider. Serafina, unable to help herself, asked whether he truly believed he would find somewhere that would pay him better than Veyron had. Callan looked at her and said no. He was not looking for somewhere that paid him more. He was looking for somewhere that finally understood what he was worth. Alistair reminded him that Veyron had built his career, as though gratitude could be exchanged for a title. Callan answered with facts instead of feeling. He had brought in hundreds of millions in revenue over 5 years. He had personally signed the company's largest clients. Several of the contracts keeping the lights on in that very building existed only because of relationships he alone had built and maintained. Year after year, phone call after phone call. He did not say any of it as a threat. He was not trying to hold the company hostage on his way out the door. He was simply stating what was true, the way he always had, the way that made him so good at his job in the first place. He stood, walked to the security desk outside, and placed his badge on the counter without a word. A few employees who had worked beside him for years watched him go with something close to reverence, understanding exactly what they had just witnessed. Others whispered behind cupped hands, certain he had just destroyed the best career in the building over pride. Serafina, for her part, was already convinced that replacing him would be simple. Numbers were numbers. Anyone could learn a system, she told herself. She would learn it faster than anyone expected. Callan walked out of the building and, for the first time in 5 years, did not turn back to look at it. In the car, his phone rang before he had even pulled out of the parking structure. The name on the screen belonged to Victor Lang, chief executive of Meridian Corp., the one company that had spent years failing to beat Veyron in every negotiation Callan had personally handled. Victor did not waste time on pleasantries. He said he had heard Callan had resigned. Callan said news traveled fast. Victor laughed and told him he had not called to offer condolences. He had called to offer something else entirely. Victor's offer was simple on paper, an executive role at Meridian. A signing bonus large enough to make most men forget the meeting they had just walked out of, and a title that would have put him, on paper, above the position he had just been denied. Callan turned it down within a week. He had spent 5 years building someone else's empire, and he understood now, with a clarity he had never quite had before, that he did not want to spend the next 5 doing the same thing under a different roof and a different name on the door. In the weeks after turning Victor down, Callan spent most of his time alone, sitting at his kitchen table with a notepad and a pot of coffee that went cold more often than it got finished. He was not drafting a business plan in any formal sense. He was simply asking himself the same question over and over, turning it in his mind the way he once turned over a difficult contract clause, looking for the angle nobody else had noticed. What had he actually built in 5 years, and how much of it belonged to him rather than to the company whose name had been printed on his business card? The answer, once he was honest with himself, was almost everything that mattered. Instead, Callan started something of his own. It began small, a consulting practice out of a rented office, with barely enough space for 2 desks and a whiteboard, offering strategic guidance to companies who needed the kind of negotiation instincts that could not be taught in a weekend seminar. He did not copy a single trade secret from Veyron. He built something new, entirely his own, out of the discipline he had spent 5 years sharpening on someone else's payroll. He focused on the fundamentals that had made him dangerous in the first place: negotiation, architecture, sales process design, client behavior analysis, and the quiet, unglamorous work of spotting risk, buried inside contract language before it ever became a crisis. Word moved the way it always does in industries built on relationships. Former clients who had once trusted only Callan's word began calling his new office directly, asking if he could take them on. Within months, the practice had outgrown the 2-desk office and moved into something larger. Callan never gave an interview. He never posted a headline about his departure or said a single critical word about Veyron Holdings in public. He built quietly, the same way he had always worked, letting the results speak in a language everyone in the industry already understood. Back at Veyron, the story unfolded very differently. Serafina rolled out a new sales framework almost immediately, eager to prove she deserved the seat her father had given her. Several of the most experienced salespeople on the floor left within the first 2 quarters, unwilling to work under a system that replaced relationship-driven selling with rigid, unproven metrics. Nolan began to feel the first threads of worry unraveling in his stomach. Chief Financial Officer Everett Sloan noticed something more concrete than worry: the numbers themselves, quarter over quarter, beginning to slide. Alistair, still certain his daughter simply needed time, dismissed every warning that reached his desk. Then, one afternoon, an email landed in the inbox of Veyron's account management team from one of their oldest, largest clients. The subject line was blunt. They wished to terminate the contract. The reason given fit in a single sentence. Callan Mercer no longer worked with the company, and neither, as of that morning, would they. It was the first crack, but it was not the last. Over the following weeks, Veyron lost account after account, each departure carrying some version of the same explanation. Serafina blamed the market. She blamed aggressive competitors playing dirty. Alistair, still shielding her from consequence, echoed the same excuses in board meetings, where the numbers told a very different story. Everett was the only one willing to say the quiet truth out loud: that these clients had never truly belonged to Veyron. They had belonged to Callan, and no spreadsheet, however well designed, could replace the trust he had spent years building, one relationship at a time. Serafina, cornered, snapped that she refused to become Callan Mercer. Everett looked at her evenly and told her that was exactly the problem. She was not being asked to become him. She was being asked to understand what he had actually done. And she did not. Determined to prove herself right, Serafina dug into the company's old sales files, searching for some flaw in Callan's methods she could point to as evidence the losses were not her fault. Instead, she found something else entirely: years-old memos, in which Callan had flagged specific contracts as carrying unacceptable risk, warnings that had been ignored by leadership at the time because the deals looked too profitable to slow down. Some of those very contracts were now the ones generating disputes and legal exposure across the company. General Counsel Mara Whitlock, working independently, arrived at similar conclusions from a different direction, reviewing the language buried inside several recently signed agreements. She found terms that placed Veyron in far more exposed positions than anyone on the executive floor seemed to understand. She brought her findings directly to Alistair, expecting urgency. What she received instead was deflection. He told her his daughter needed time to grow into the role. Mara asked, plainly, what would happen to the company while she did. Nobody in the room had an answer. Meanwhile, Callan's consulting practice had grown large enough to attract serious attention. A private equity group offered to buy the company outright for a sum that would have let him retire comfortably before the age of 50. Callan turned it down without hesitation. He had spent 5 years building someone else's value, and 1 year building his own. And he was not going to hand it over for a number on a page, however large that number happened to be. Not long after, a document reached his desk: Veyron's most recent quarterly financials, forwarded to him by a former colleague who still trusted his judgment more than anyone currently sitting in that boardroom. Callan read through the figures slowly, line by line, the way he had once read through contracts other people were too impatient to finish. He set the document down and said, quietly, to no one but himself, that it had happened faster than even he expected. Part of him understood that a smaller man might have felt something closer to satisfaction reading those numbers, a quiet vindication after being told, in that same building, that his talent for selling had nothing to do with talent for leading. Callan did not allow himself that indulgence. Satisfaction built on someone else's failure was a cheap kind of currency, and he had never once, in 5 years of negotiation, built anything valuable out of something cheap. He did not celebrate. He was not the kind of man who took pleasure in watching something collapse, even something that had once treated him as replaceable. But he began, carefully and methodically, to understand exactly what was happening inside the walls he had once called home, using nothing but publicly available information and the instincts 5 years of experience had carved into him. Veyron was not merely losing clients. It was losing cash flow. Several large contracts, signed quickly and carelessly under Serafina's new leadership, carried terms that could expose the company to catastrophic liability if they went wrong. Mara arrived at the same discovery from the legal side, tracing a pattern of unusual clauses across multiple recent deals, clauses that could force Veyron into massive settlement payments under circumstances that now looked increasingly likely. Serafina insisted, again and again, that none of it had been intentional. Alistair, for the first time, allowed himself to question not just his daughter's readiness, but the entire structure of decision-making he had built the company on. Still, he could not bring himself to admit, out loud, that the mistake had been his own to begin with. Mara's discoveries did not stop at a handful of unusual clauses. The deeper she dug through the contracts signed in the last year, the more she found a pattern that troubled her far more than any single mistake could have. Deadlines had been compressed. Standard review processes, the ones that had once required 2 separate sign-offs before a contract went out for signature, had quietly been shortened to 1. Clients who might once have been given a week to review terms were being pushed to sign within days, a pace that suited a leader eager to prove herself, but did nothing to protect the company from the kind of exposure buried in fine print. Nobody had time to read carefully. She raised the pattern with Alistair twice, and twice he told her the same thing in slightly different words. His daughter was finding her footing. She would tighten the process once she settled into the role. Mara left both meetings with the same unanswered question sitting in her chest, wondering how many more contracts would need to go out the door before settling in stopped being an acceptable excuse for exposing the entire company to risk it could not afford to carry. Around the same time, an intermediary approached Callan with an offer that would have handed him real leverage, the chance to purchase a portion of Veyron's distressed debt at a steep discount, a move that could have placed him in a position to dictate terms to the very people who had once dismissed him in that boardroom. It was, by any measure, the perfect opportunity for revenge. Callan refused. He told the intermediary he wanted to win through competence, not by standing over the throat of a company already gasping for air. He was no longer the man who had walked out of Veyron a year earlier with nothing but a folded resignation letter and a bruised sense of what he was owed. He had become something else entirely, a businessman with real leverage, real choices, and the discipline not to use either one carelessly. Victor Lang, watching from a distance, called him again around this time, half expecting Callan to finally accept the offer he had turned down a year earlier, now that he had proven himself capable of far more than anyone at Meridian had originally imagined. Callan declined a second time, just as calmly as the first. Victor asked, almost amused, whether anything could actually convince him to work for someone else again. Callan told him the truth. Probably not. He had spent 5 years learning exactly what his own judgment was worth, and he had no intention of handing that judgment over to another chairman's office, however comfortable the salary attached to it might be. Not long after, Alistair received a report from his own finance team that stopped him cold. Veyron had only weeks left before it would breach the covenants tied to its primary credit facility, a violation that could trigger immediate repayment demands the company had no way to meet. He sat with the report in silence for a long moment. Then, his phone rang. The name on the screen read, Callan Mercer. Alistair answered, his voice sharper than he intended, and asked whether Callan was calling to laugh at him. Callan told him no. He was calling because he had a proposal. The offer was straightforward, at least on the surface. Callan wanted to acquire a strategic stake in specific assets of the company, an infusion that would give Veyron breathing room while it restructured its obligations. Alistair, immediately defensive, accused him of circling like a vulture over a wounded animal, waiting to pick the company apart while it could not fight back. Callan calmly pointed out that his offer was, in fact, the least painful option on the table. Without it, the bank would tighten its terms further. Remaining clients would continue their exodus, and the company risked being broken apart piece by creditors with far less patience than he had. Serafina objected loudly, certain this was nothing more than revenge dressed up as a rescue. Callan looked at her and said, without raising his voice, that if revenge had been his goal, he would have simply let them collapse on their own and watched from a distance. The room went quiet at that. Mara, listening carefully, began to see the sense in his position from a purely analytical standpoint. Everett recognized something else entirely, that Callan had understood the shape of this crisis long before anyone currently in the room had been willing to see it coming. Alistair asked what Callan actually wanted out of this. Callan told him it was not the seat he had once wanted. He paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to matter, and then said what he wanted instead was the authority to make decisions. Alistair asked what would happen if he refused the offer altogether. Callan stood, buttoned his jacket, and told him that 1 year from now, he would wish he had said yes today. The board convened an emergency session the following week, and Callan walked back into the building exactly 1 year, almost to the day, since he had walked out of it. The people seated around that table were the same people who had watched him place his badge on the counter and leave without looking back. This time, he did not sit in the chair reserved for staff waiting to be addressed. He was not staff anymore. Before he spoke a single word of strategy, Callan let the silence in the room settle for a moment longer than was comfortable. He looked around the table at faces he had not seen in a year, some older, some visibly worn down by 12 months of a crisis they had not known how to stop, all of them waiting to hear what the man they had once dismissed as merely a talented salesman now had to say about saving the company they had built their entire careers around. He did not need to remind any of them what had happened the last time he sat in this room. The memory was doing that work on its own. He laid out his plan with the same calm precision he had once used to close contracts other people considered impossible. A restructuring proposal designed to satisfy the bank without gutting the company's operational core. A negotiation strategy for the outstanding creditors, one built around leverage points he had identified through nothing more than careful analysis, and a network of relationships he had spent years cultivating and never abandoned. A retention strategy aimed squarely at the clients still on the fence, the ones who had not yet left but were watching closely to see whether Veyron could still be trusted. And finally, a redesign of the sales division itself, stripped of the untested framework that had driven so much talent out the door in the first place. Serafina tried, more than once, to push back on specific points, searching for weaknesses in his reasoning the way she had once searched for weaknesses in his old memos. She found none worth arguing. Callan never attacked her directly. He never once raised his voice or made the meeting personal. He simply answered every objection with data, with precedent, with the calm certainty of a man who had already run every possible scenario before walking into the room. Every response left her with less ground to stand on than the last. Alistair sat through the presentation with a growing, uncomfortable clarity. He had spent a year believing Callan needed Veyron to matter. Watching him now, commanding a room he no longer had any formal obligation to be in, Alistair began to understand the truth had always run the other way. Nolan, who had once stood firmly behind Serafina's promotion without question, spoke up in front of the entire board and admitted, plainly, that they had been wrong. For a woman who had spent her entire adult life being told, in one form or another, that her name alone opened every door worth walking through, the silence of that room was a different kind of education than anything she had received in a boardroom before. Nobody was shouting at her, nobody needed to. The numbers on the screen behind Callan had already said everything that needed saying, in a language far more convincing than any argument her father could have made on her behalf. Serafina sat through the admission in silence, forced to confront something no title could shield her from, that the seat she had been handed had never, on its own, been able to produce the results the company actually needed. Callan did not push the moment further than it needed to go. He made it clear, without hesitation, that he had no interest in seeing her removed, simply to prove a point he had already proven 100 times over in the numbers alone. When the presentation ended, Alistair rose from his seat and asked Callan directly what position he wanted if his plan succeeded in saving the company. Callan looked at him and said he did not want a position at all. The words landed heavier in that room than any title ever could have. What he wanted instead, he explained, were conditions. Full independence over strategic business decisions, free from interference by family ties or legacy politics. A commitment that leadership across the company would be evaluated strictly on performance going forward, with no exceptions carved out for bloodline. An end to appointments made on the basis of relation rather than results. And complete transparency around every strategic contract the company signed, reviewed by legal counsel with real authority to flag risk before ink ever touched paper. Alistair struggled visibly with the terms, the muscles in his jaw working as though he were chewing on something bitter. Serafina said nothing at all, staring at the table in front of her. Mara spoke up in support of every condition Callan had laid out, and Everett followed close behind her, his voice steady with the conviction of a man who had watched the numbers prove Callan right for months. In the end, Alistair signed. Callan did not return to Veyron as an employee. He came back as an independent strategic partner, bound to the company by contract and by results, not by loyalty or obligation. Serafina remained with the company, but she began again in a role that actually matched her demonstrated capability, stripped of the assumptions that had once carried her past people far more qualified than she was. She requested a private meeting with him not long after the terms were finalized. For the first time since he had known her, there was no trace of superiority in the way she carried herself. She told him she had once believed he resigned that day purely out of wounded pride. Callan told her that was not true. He had resigned because he already knew, with total certainty, exactly what he was worth. She asked quietly whether he would have done anything differently if he could return to that exact day and make the choice again. Callan did not hesitate. No, he did not need Veyron's recognition anymore. The only recognition that had ever mattered, in the end, was the kind a man builds for himself. Brick by brick, deal by deal. In the years nobody is watching closely enough to notice, not long after the agreement was finalized, Alistair asked to see him privately, away from the noise of the boardroom. On the desk between them sat a thick, aging folder Callan had never seen before. Alistair slid it across the table and told him there was something about the last 5 years he had never known. The folder contained records Callan had never been shown at the time, internal reports crediting him, quietly and without fanfare, for pulling the company back from the edge of collapse on at least 2 prior occasions, years before Serafina had ever been given a seat at that table. Both times, his work had been filed away as simply another task completed by an employee doing his job, never elevated, never acknowledged beyond a line item in a report nobody outside finance ever read. Alistair, turning the pages slowly, admitted what should have been obvious to him years earlier. He had trusted blood over evidence. He had dismissed outsiders as lesser, regardless of what they proved with their own hands. He had confused the comfort of power with the discipline of competence, and the confusion had nearly cost him everything he had spent a lifetime building. Callan did not need an apology, and he told him so plainly. What Alistair owed was not owed to him personally. It was owed to the company itself, a single correct decision, made without hesitation, the next time a choice like that presented itself again. The first 90 days after the agreement were the hardest, though almost none of that difficulty played out in front of an audience. Callan spent long stretches on the road, sitting across from clients who had already made up their minds to leave, rebuilding trust one conversation at a time the same way he had built it in the first place. Some listened, some did not. He never pushed harder than a relationship could bear, and he never promised more than the company could actually deliver. A discipline that had once made him the most reliable name in every negotiation he touched, and now became the exact thing Veyron needed to survive. Serafina, working under the new framework, began sitting in on some of those meetings herself, watching rather than leading, taking notes the way she once might have dismissed as beneath her. She asked questions afterward, real questions, the kind that come from someone finally willing to admit they do not already know the answer. Callan answered every one of them honestly, without condescension, the same way he had always spoken to people who were willing to actually listen. Over the months that followed, Veyron slowly climbed back from the edge. Clients who had walked away began returning, drawn back by a company that finally operated the way it should have all along. The new business framework, built on Callan's terms and overseen with real transparency, began producing results the old system never could have matched. Serafina, freed from the pressure of pretending to be someone she was not, began to grow into a role that actually fit her, learning in months what a title alone could never have taught her. Everett and Mara became the loudest advocates inside the building for the very reforms that had once seemed radical to a board built on legacy and comfort. He kept the two operations deliberately separate, a boundary he never once considered blurring, even as Veyron's leadership occasionally hinted that a more permanent arrangement might benefit everyone involved. His own company had grown into something with a client roster and a reputation entirely independent of the Veyron name, and he was not willing to fold 5 years of independent effort back into the very structure that had once told him his years of service amounted to nothing more than a talent for selling. Independence, he had learned the hard way, was worth more than any title a family business could offer him. Callan continued running his own company throughout all of it, never folding it into Veyron, never trading his independence for a corner office with his name freshly painted on the door. The relationship between the two of them shifted permanently, no longer employer and employee, no longer a man who had been overlooked and the family that had overlooked him, but two equal parties bound by results and mutual respect earned the hard way. At the company's next results announcement, held in the same room where Callan had once set down his badge and walked away, Alistair stood in front of the assembled staff and spoke without notes. For 5 years, he said, Callan Mercer had been the finest salesman the company had ever employed, and in the single year he had been gone, he had become something far more valuable, the reason an entire company had finally been forced to understand what real value actually looked like. The room rose to its feet. Callan simply nodded, offering nothing more than the same quiet composure he had carried into that very room 5 years earlier. He had nothing left to prove to anyone in that space, and everyone in it knew it. He walked out of the building afterward into the evening air, and before he had crossed the block, his phone rang. A new client was on the line, asking him personally to lead a major negotiation they had spent months trying to close on their own. Callan looked out at the skyline stretching in front of him, unhurried, unshaken, entirely certain of exactly who he was. "Send the contract," he said, and kept walking. He was not the man Veyron had once dismissed at a table that decided he was worth less than a name he did not share. He was the man who had forced an entire company to relearn, the hard way, what a person's value actually looks like when it is finally measured on its own terms. In the years since, the story of that boardroom meeting became something people at Veyron still repeated quietly among themselves, not as gossip, but as a kind of lesson passed from one generation of employees to the next. New hires heard the abbreviated version within their first month. The top performer who set down his badge, instead of arguing for a promotion he had already earned 5 times over, and the year that followed, which taught an entire company more about value than any strategy document ever could have. Nobody told the story to frighten anyone. They told it because it was true, and because the truth of it had reshaped the way the company measured every decision that came after. Some people walk away because they have failed. Others walk away because they have finally understood that the room they are standing in will never be big enough to hold what they are truly worth.